This is OpenTUI, a Zig-powered library for building terminal interfaces with bindings for React, Solid, and Three.js, so you can build performant TUIs the same way you build web applications. It was built by Anomaly, the team behind OpenCode, which is a popular open source coding agent, to actually power the user interface behind OpenCode, which is used by millions of people on a regular basis. But how does this new library go up against the other popular React terminal interface tool that has been around for much longer and is used to power many popular coding agents? Hit subscribe and let's find out. So Ink is the go-to library for building terminal interfaces with React. I've actually made a video about it that you can check out over here. But it does have some problems. First of all, for simple apps, it uses more than 50 megabytes of memory and has a hard-coded 30 FPS cap, which is fine for most applications. But if you're building an app that streams in lots of text, like a coding agent, then the frame cap makes the whole thing feel sluggish. So the team at Anomaly, who originally used Golang with bubble T to build OpenCode, wanted to rewrite it in TypeScript without using Ink. So they created OpenTUI. They bought OpenTUI. They didn't exactly build it from scratch because Commander FX was already building a Zig-based terminal library, so Anomaly sponsored him and built OpenTUI on top of his work. So the Zig core does all the heavy rendering, and the TypeScript bindings allows you to write UI components in React or Solid. But the really clever part is the bun foreign function interface, which allows you to speak directly from TypeScript to the Zig native code without much delay, which is what makes OpenTUI super performant. It uses Yoga for Flexbox layouts, comes with built-in components like inputs and selects, and there's even a Three.js package that lets you render web GPU 3D graphics inside the terminal, which is kind of insane. In fact, let's see OpenTUI in action by trying it on a very simple demo. There are many ways you can set up a basic OpenTUI project. Personally, I like using bun create TUI because it gives you this very useful wizard you can use to give a name to your project and choose the template you want to use. Now, I'm going to go with React, but I'll explain later on in the video the differences between these three templates. So once that's done, you get some standard files with an index that runs a basic full screen project. And if we look at the code, we can see here on line 15 that it's using the create CLI renderer to make use of OpenTUI's rendering engine. And beneath that, there's create root, which renders the app component. And if you're familiar with React, this is the code that mounts it to a HTML file, but because we're rendering to a terminal, this project doesn't have an index.html, but instead this uses a custom React reconciler that uses terminal boxes and text instead of HTML components. Above that, we have the JSX that uses the box component and some Yoga Flexbox props to align the box nested inside it. That renders an ASCII font and some basic text. Now, if you didn't want this to be a full screen app, OpenTUI supports multiple screen modes, and we can change this one to split footer with a footer height, which pins the render to a reserved region at the bottom of the terminal. But let's try and do something a bit more interesting than just changing the screen mode. Here is a basic TUI with some title text and a name input. Now check this out, with OpenTUI you get responsiveness for free, so no matter the width of my terminal, everything still looks good. And if we take a look at the code, it's using some very familiar React syntax. So over here we have a use state that's setting the name, and in the input, we're updating the name on the onInput prop, and that gets changed in the text. Now, one really cool thing OpenTUI does is kind of live reloading without the HMR. So we can see here, if I change the text to goodbye and then save the file, it gets automatically updated. And it's nice having a responsive input, but sometimes the text just doesn't show. This can be fixed by adding a width, which makes things much easier. And with the box component, we have some very cool props like border and background color, which immediately ages this terminal app. Again, we can use an ASCII font instead of this text, which makes the heading stand out a bit more. And of course, there are many ASCII fonts you can choose from. Remember, because this is a terminal app, not a web page, it doesn't render all the fonts you have on your system, just things that support the terminal. We can also do things like change the view on submit, the same way you do with a regular React app by changing the state on submit and displaying different JSX based on this condition. But here's one thing you wouldn't expect a terminal to be able to do. If I submit my name, the other state now fades into place. And this is done with the use timeline hook from OpenTUI, which is used to set an animation duration, set a target. So in this case, the component has an opacity of 0 and an offset of 8, meaning it has a margin top below the center. And here the animation ends with an offset of 0 and an opacity of 1 by updating the offset and opacity states that were set up here. And these values are updated in the box props. Now it does look a little jerky because terminal animations need to move row by row, so kind of like on a grid, but it's very cool that OpenTUI allows you to do this so easily. What's really cool is that we can combine everything we've learned so far using the Flexbox layout to put boxes next to each other, so we've got an input on one side and another box on the other, and if we type into the input, on submit, we can animate the value going into the other box, which is a very nice touch. And from here, we can do so many things with OpenTUI, like enable keyboard navigation, with the use keyboard hook, show system data using Node OS, enable mouse support, virtualized lists, and because this is all running on top of Bun, you can use things like the Bun SQLite, Bun Postgres, or fetch external information the same way you do on any website. And the cool thing about this is after I compiled my app, yes, it is 71 megabytes because it includes the Bun runtime and the React reconciliation, but when I run it, you can see it uses less than 50 megabytes of memory. And because React is so popular, LLMs know it like the back of their hand, and so building apps in OpenTUI can be very simple without the need to go back and forth looking at the documentation. So that's a very, very simple run through of OpenTUI, but let's go way back to earlier in the video where I promised I'd explain the difference between React, Solid, and Core. So it's pretty simple if you know about front-end web development. Basically, they all render through the exact same Zig core, so the actual drawing to your terminal is pretty identical. The only difference is how you write your components and how the updates get applied. So React reruns your components and diffs a virtual tree on every change, which is pretty similar to how the virtual DOM works. Solid uses fine-grained updates, so only updates the thing that changed, and Core skips all of that, meaning you just mutate the objects directly. So on paper, React is the heaviest and Core is the lightest. But in practice, for most terminal apps, the gap is tiny because all the heavy lifting is done by the Zig core, which means in this case, frameworks are just a personal preference. But even though an OpenTUI app ships with the whole Bun runtime and the framework-specific reconciliation if it has one, the performance and the size of the app is still much smaller than Ink, but of course not as performant as something native like Ratatouille or Bubble Tea. But in my opinion, JSX is the best and most intuitive way to compose any UI, and I'd rather take the slight memory and size hit and have a much better developer experience building a TUI than to have something that's light in size and light in memory usage, but a pain to write and update. So with that in mind, I'd pick OpenTUI over Ink every single time, if I ever get around to building a terminal application, which I promise I will do soon.